The Arizona Territory was a land that didn't just test you, it burned away your illusions. For Eliza Gray, it burned away everything. In 1873, she wasn't captured in a raid or lost on the trail. She was sold, traded by the man she was supposed to marry, Silas Blackwood, to a band of Chiricahua Apache in a desperate bargain to save his own skin. She became a slave, a ghost in a world that wanted her dead. But destiny holds a cruel sense of irony. Sometimes, the only way to find your life is to have it utterly destroyed. And then, the storm hits. The dust of Fort Gamble, Arizona Territory, had a taste. It was a bitter grit of iron, dead dreams, and alkali, and Eliza Gray swallowed it down every single day. It was 1873, and the fort was little more than a dozen heat-blasted adobe buildings huddled together, cowering under the vast, indifferent blue of the desert sky. Eliza had arrived 3 months prior, promised a new life and a swift marriage to Silas Blackwood, the proprietor of the Blackwood Mercantile and Freight. Silas. He was a man carved from the territory itself, handsome in a sharp, sun-scorched way, with eyes the color of a faded denim shirt and a voice as smooth as poured whiskey. He had courted her back in St. Louis with letters full of promise, a grand home, a position of respect, a future built on silver and ambition. The reality was a one-room shack behind his failing store, and a man whose charm had begun to curdle. "Eliza, my dear," he'd said just this morning, his fingers tight on her shoulder, "you are the only pure thing in this God-forsaken place, my salvation." His salvation felt more like collateral. The mercantile was failing. The freight line was a joke, consistently losing wagons to what he claimed were Apache raids. His creditors, men with hard faces and guns worn low, had stopped visiting. That, Eliza learned, was the worst sign. The day it happened, the air was stretched thin and brittle, like old glass. A sirocco wind blew from the south, carrying the smell of mesquite and something metallic. Silas had been gone for 2 days. On a purchasing trip to Tucson, he'd claimed, but he'd taken no wagons. Eliza was hanging laundry behind the shack, a pathetic gesture of domesticity, when she saw them. They didn't ride in whooping or firing. They emerged from the shimmering heat haze like spirits. 5 Apache warriors on wiry ponies, their skin the color of burnished copper, their black hair held back by simple headbands. They were led by a man with a face like a hawk, his eyes black and unreadable. He was Cale. She didn't know his name then. She only knew he was the face of her deepest fears. She froze. The clothespin fell from her numb fingers. Silas Blackwood rode out from the stables to meet them. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't afraid. He was negotiating. Eliza crept closer, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She hid behind a stack of empty barrels, the stench of stale beer stinging her nose. "Is a problem," Silas was saying, his voice calm. "The U.S. Marshal, Joseph Phelps, is sniffing around. My last wagon. It wasn't you who took it. It was raiders. White men." Cale just watched him. "I need passage," Silas said, desperation finally leaking through the velvet. "Safe passage south, to the border. And I need indemnity. You let my wagons pass, and I'll keep the soldiers looking in the wrong places." Cale spoke, his voice low and rough, not in English. The man beside him, older, translated. "You have nothing. Your wagons are empty. Your store is full of dust. You promise wind." "I have this," Silas snapped. He turned, his eyes scanning the settlement. He wasn't looking for her. He knew where she was. He walked directly to the barrels. He grabbed her arm, his grip a vice, and hauled her out into the blinding sun. Eliza cried out, a small, strangled sound. "No, Silas, what are you?" He threw her to her knees in the dust. "She's healthy," Silas said, his voice shaking but gaining strength. "She's strong. From the east. No family out here. No one will look for her." Eliza looked up at him. The betrayal so absolute, so sudden, it stole her breath. This was the man who had kissed her, who had called her his salvation. Cale's eyes flickered to her. He saw the new calico dress, the pale skin already blistering, the sheer, unadulterated terror. He dismounted. He walked over to her, circled her as one might a horse. He reached out and grabbed a handful of her honey-blonde hair, pulling her head back. Eliza whimpered, tears cutting clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. Cale looked at Silas. He spoke in Apache, and the translator relayed. "One woman, for safe passage?" "And guns," Silas said, pointing to a covered crate near the stables. 10 new Spencer rifles and 1,000 rounds. Payment for the last wagon I conveniently lost. This was the twist. Silas hadn't lost his wagons to the Apache. He'd been selling them. He was arming them, playing both sides against the middle. And now the game was up. He was cashing in his last chip. Her. Cale studied her for a long moment. He saw the terror, but he also saw the straightness of her spine, the defiance in her eyes, even as she wept. He saw good teeth, strong hands. He nodded once. "Silas, please," Eliza begged, clutching at his boots. "Don't do this. I'll do anything. Please." He kicked her hand away, his face a mask of cold necessity. "It's this or a noose, Eliza. We all have to make sacrifices." The Apache warriors didn't bind her. They didn't need to. One of them, a young, cruel-looking man, simply grabbed the rope on her laundry line, looped it around her neck, and tied the other end to his saddle horn. They pulled her out of Fort Gamble at a fast walk. The last thing Eliza Gray saw was Silas Blackwood, her betrothed, wiping his dusty hands on his trousers, already turning back toward the stables to saddle his own horse for his ride south. She was traded for 10 rifles and the escape of a coward. She didn't scream again. She just walked, the alkali dust filling her lungs, her mind shattered into 1,000 pieces. The price of Silas's salvation was her soul. The journey to the rancheria was a blur of calculated cruelty. The warrior holding her rope, whom she later learned was named Goya, the Sly, seemed to take pleasure in her suffering. He'd urge his pony into a trot, forcing Eliza to run in her flimsy town shoes until her lungs burned and her feet were raw. When she fell, she was dragged. The rope, at first a symbol of her capture, became her lifeline. It was the only thing keeping her from being left behind in the vast, hostile emptiness of the Dragoon Mountains. They traveled for 2 days, climbing from the sun-blasted flats into the winding canyons and pine-dotted high country. This was Apacheria, a land she had only heard about in whispered, terrified stories. Now she was its prisoner. Cale, the leader, rarely looked at her. He rode at the head, his focus on the horizon, on the subtle signs of the trail. He seemed less a man than a piece of the landscape, an embodiment of its unforgiving will. When they finally arrived at the rancheria, it was not the chaotic, filthy camp she'd imagined. It was hidden in a high-walled canyon, a stream of clear water running through it, shaded by ancient cottonwoods. Wickiups, domed huts made of brush and hide, were scattered neatly. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting mescal, and people. Her arrival caused a stir. Children, naked and dusty, ran out to stare, their black eyes wide with curiosity. Women, their faces impassive, paused in their work, grinding corn, scraping hides, to watch her. She was a trophy, a curiosity, a thing. Goya yanked her rope, pulling her toward the center of the camp, and presented her to an older woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes that burned with a cold, ancient anger. This was Tala. Cale spoke to Tala, his voice low. Eliza caught no words, only the tone and order. Tala spat on the ground near Eliza's feet, then grabbed her by the hair, dragging her toward a small, smoky wickiup at the edge of the camp. This was Eliza's new home. This was her new life. The word slave was a white man's word. The Apache word, she would learn, was bistik, a drudge, a captive, less than human. Tala's hatred was a physical thing. Eliza soon learned why. Tala's husband and 2 sons had been killed at Camp Grant, not in a battle, but in a massacre, murdered by white vigilantes from Tucson while the warriors were away. To Tala, Eliza was not a person. She was the color of the men who had stolen her world. She was vengeance to be taken in small, daily doses. Eliza's life was reduced to brutal, relentless labor. Before dawn, Tala would kick her awake. She hauled water in heavy clay pots from the stream. She foraged for firewood, her hands soon cracked and bleeding. Her primary duty, however, was the mescal pit. She spent 10 hours a day grinding the roasted hearts of the agave plant on a stone metate. The work was backbreaking. The fibers of the plant were tough, and the smell was cloyingly sweet. Her soft, pale hands were shredded in the first day. By the end of the week, they were covered in a weeping crust of blood and grit. She was given the scraps to eat, the burned bits of mescal, a handful of fire-blackened corn. She was always hungry, always tired, always filthy. The calico dress was torn to rags, and Tala gave her a simple, rough-spun buckskin shift, not out of kindness, but because her tattered white woman's dress was an offense. The language was a wall. She understood nothing. The laughter of the other women as she struggled with the water pots was a sharp, painful sting. They pointed. They mocked. She was alone, utterly. In those first weeks, she thought often of ending it. The stream was deep in places. The cliffs were high, but 2 things kept her alive. The first was pure, unadulterated rage, a cold, hard diamond of fury at Silas Blackwood. She would not let him be the end of her story. She would not let his betrayal be her epitaph. She would live, if only to spite his memory. The second was Cale. He never spoke to her. He never intervened in Tala's daily cruelties, but she would feel his eyes on her. While she was grinding mescal, she would look up and see him, standing by the horse lines, watching her. His face was always impassive, his thoughts hidden. It wasn't kindness. It was assessment. He was watching his investment, the price of 10 rifles. He was gauging her will. Was she strong, or would she break? Eliza, in her misery, mistook his observation for a different kind of threat. He was the man who had bought her. He was the leader. In her world, that meant he owned her, body and soul. She waited every night, her heart pounding in her chest, for him to come to her wickiup. But he never did. He never touched her. He never even approached. One evening, Goya, the sly warrior, his breath thick with tiswin, a fermented corn drink, cornered her by the stream. He grabbed her, his intentions clear, his hands rough. Eliza screamed, a raw animal sound, and she fought back. She gouged her nails into his face. She bit his hand. She kicked and thrashed with the fury of a cornered bobcat. He backhanded her, sending her sprawling into the mud. He laughed, a low, guttural sound, and advanced on her. Enough. The word was spoken in English, clear, sharp, and cold. Kyle stood 10 feet away, a shadow detached from the darkness. He hadn't raised his voice, but the effect was instant. Goya froze, the drunken haze evaporating from his eyes, replaced by fear. Kale said something in Apache. Goya's face tightened. He looked from Kale to Eliza, his eyes full of hatred, and then he spat at her feet and stalked away. Eliza lay in the mud, gasping, shaking. Kyle stood there for a long moment, his form a black silhouette against the moonlight. He looked down at her, this trembling, filthy creature who'd been a lady 3 weeks ago. "Get up," he said, again in perfect, unaccented English. Eliza stared, shocked to her core. He spoke English. He had understood her pleas, her cries, everything. She pushed herself up, her ripped shift clinging to her. "You will work," he said, his voice flat. "You will not cry. You will not be weak. You will survive. Or you will not. It is your choice." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Eliza stood there, the cold mud of the stream bank seeping into her skin. He had offered her no comfort, no kindness, no rescue. He had only offered her a choice: work or die, survive or don't. That night, for the first time, Eliza didn't cry. She cleaned the mud from her face, went to her wickiup, and stared into the darkness, her rage and her will hardening into something new, something the desert would recognize. Summer in the high desert was a season of violence. The heat built relentlessly, culminating in the Ende Bizarre, the Apache name for the monsoon season. The sky, for weeks a pale, washed-out blue, began to bruise with clouds the color of deep plum. Eliza had been with the Chiricahua for 2 months. Her hands were no longer soft. They were calloused, scarred, and strong. Her skin was baked to a deep brown, and her hair, once her vanity, was a tangled, sun-bleached mat. She understood more Apache than she let on, the language of commands and insults sinking in through sheer repetition. Her relationship with Tala had not improved, but it had settled into a grim routine. The beatings had stopped. Kale's silent disapproval was a powerful deterrent, but the hatred remained, a constant, low-burning fire. Eliza, for her part, had taken Kale's words to heart. She worked. She hauled more water, ground more mescal, and gathered more wood than any 2 women. She did it silently, her face a mask. The other women, who had once mocked her, now watched her with a new, grudging respect. She was not weak. She did not break. Then the sky tore open. It began one afternoon. The air became thick, yellow, and heavy. An unnatural quiet fell over the rancheria, the birds and insects falling silent. The Apaches, too, became quiet, securing their wickiups, moving the horses to high ground. Stone Gazer, the old Dian or shaman, emerged from his lodge and began to chant, his voice a low rumble, casting sacred Hottenton, pollen, to the wind. The first drop of rain was as large as a thumb. Then the deluge began. It was not a rain. It was a solid wall of water, a celestial ocean dumped from the sky. The wind howled through the canyon, ripping at the brush huts. Within minutes, the dry, dusty camp was a sea of mud. The stream, normally a placid, ankle-deep ribbon of life, began to roar. Eliza was huddled in Tala's wickiup, which was set on slightly lower ground. Water was already pooling on the floor. Tala was trying to secure a hide flap, muttering angrily, when a woman's shriek cut through the storm. "Chispa! My son! He is gone!" It was Iyala, Tala's sister-in-law. Her son, Little Hawk, a quiet 5-year-old boy, whom Eliza had often seen watching her with solemn eyes. had been playing near the stream. Eliza and Tala burst from the wickiup into the chaos. The stream was no longer a stream. It was a churning brown river, white-fanged with rapids, already 10 feet deep and rising. It was pulling at the foundations of the wickiups closest to the bank. Eliza saw him. Little Hawk. He hadn't been swept away. Not yet. He had been playing in a small, dry arroyo that fed the stream, and it had become a trap. A flash flood, a wall of water, had come down the arroyo, and he was clinging to the roots of a small, precarious willow tree, the water raging 3 feet below him. But the bank was crumbling. Iala was hysterical. The warriors, Kale among them, were further up the canyon, trying to save the horse herd from a mudslide. Tala saw her nephew and screamed his name, a sound of pure, primal anguish. She ran toward him, but the ground between them was already a swamp of sucking mud. Eliza didn't think. She reacted. Back in St. Louis, her father, a merchant, had owned a warehouse on the Mississippi. She had spent her childhood watching the dockhands, learning their knots, learning how they handled ropes and floods. "The rope!" she screamed at Tala, using the Apache word she knew, "Sauce. Get a rope." Tala just stared at her, paralyzed by panic. Eliza shoved her, hard. "Rope! Now!" Her command, so sharp, so clear, broke Tala's terror. Tala sprinted back to her wickiup and returned with a long, plaited rawhide lariat. The arroyo was 20 feet across. Eliza couldn't reach him. The boy was crying, his small hands slipping. "Hold it!" Eliza yelled, grabbing the lariat. She wrapped it twice around her own waist, digging her heels into the mud. She looked at Tala. "Do not let go." Tala, her face a mask of terror, grabbed the rope. The other women, seeing what was happening, ran over and grabbed it too. A human anchor. Eliza didn't try to cross. She knew the current would take her. She waded into the churning water at the edge, the pull of it terrifying, until the arroyo bank was a sheer, muddy cliff. "Little Hawk!" she screamed, using his Apache name. "Chispa! Look at me!" The boy's terrified eyes found hers. "You must jump!" she yelled in English, pointing. "Jump to me!" He didn't understand. The willow tree groaned, its roots pulling free. "Tala!" Eliza shouted. "Tell him!" Tala screamed the command in Apache. "Peon! Jump!" The boy looked at his aunt, then at Eliza. He closed his eyes and let go. He vanished under the brown water. Eliza's heart stopped. A second later, his head popped up. He was being swept downstream. Eliza threw herself, not into the main current, but down the bank, sliding in the mud, parallel to the water, keeping the rope taut. She was a pendulum. She landed in the churning water just as he passed, her arms outstretched, her fingers closed on his small wrist. The force of the water and his weight was incredible. It ripped her from the bank. The rope snapped taut, biting into her waist, driving the air from her lungs. She and the boy were submerged, tossed in the violent cold water. "Pull!" she heard Tala roar. The women on the bank, Tala at their head, dug in their heels and hauled. They dragged Eliza and the boy, sputtering, choking, through the mud and back onto solid ground. Eliza collapsed, coughing up dirty water, her arms still locked around the small, trembling boy. He was alive. He was safe. She looked up. The rancheria was silent, save for the roar of the storm. Kyle and the other warriors had returned. They were standing on the high ground, watching. Kale's face was unreadable, but he was staring at her, at this white woman, this bistic, covered in mud, who had just risked her life for an Apache child. Eliza staggered to her feet, holding Little Hawk. She walked the 10 feet to Tala, her legs shaking. Tala looked at her, her face wet with rain and tears. Her eyes, once so full of hate, were now wide with a terrible dawning confusion. Eliza pushed the boy into his aunt's arms. Then, her strength gone, she crumpled to the ground and passed out. When Eliza awoke, she was not in Tala's wickiup. She was on a soft pile of buffalo robes in a different, larger lodge. The air was dry and smelled of sage and sweetgrass. A small, carefully banked fire glowed in the center. Her head ached, and her ribs felt like they had been kicked by a mule, the cost of the lariat. Her wet, filthy buckskin shift had been replaced by a clean, dry one. She sat up, her head spinning. "You drink," a low voice commanded. Stone Gazer, the old DN, was sitting across the fire from her. He held out a small, intricately carved wooden cup. The liquid inside was warm and bitter. Eliza hesitated. "It is not poison," he said, his English as clear as Cale's. "It is for the water in your lungs and the pain in your side." Eliza drank. The potion burned a path down her throat, but it settled her stomach, and a warm, spreading peace began to dull the ache in her body. Little Hawk?" she asked, her voice a croak. "Chispa as well," Stone Gazer said. "He sleeps. His mother and his aunt sit with him. Tala, she does not understand you." "Neither do I," Eliza whispered, looking at her hands. They were hers, yet they were not. "You saved the boy," the shaman stated. "He was a child. The water was... "You did not run," Stone Gazer interrupted. "The White Eyes run. They run from us, or they run at us. You had a choice. You could have run. Saved yourself. Why did you not?" Eliza met his eyes, which were old as the mountains, wrinkled at the corners, and held no malice. "Where would I run to? This is where I am." The shaman stared at her for a long time, the firelight catching the silver in his hair. "You have a strong spirit," he said finally, as if concluding a long internal debate. "It is a spirit that has been misplaced, but it is strong." He nodded. "Tala will not harm you again. You are no longer Beastic. You are Inde, the people. You will learn from me now." Eliza's life changed overnight. She was moved from Tala's lodge to a small wickiup of her own, next to Stone Gazer's. Her days of grinding mezcal were over. She was now the shaman's apprentice. Her new work was more difficult, but it was work of the mind and the spirit. Stone Gazer, she learned, was not just a medicine man. He was the tribe's historian, doctor, and philosopher. He decided that Eliza's medicine was strong and that it needed to be trained. He taught her the herbs. He took her on long walks into the mountains, showing her the pale green yerba mansa for inflammation, the osha root for coughs, the red tuberosa blossoms for the heart. Eliza, who had a quick, orderly mind, absorbed it all. She had learned basic botany and chemistry from her tutors in St. Louis, and she found herself blending that forgotten knowledge with the Dean's ancient wisdom. She learned the Apache language in earnest now, not just the commands, but the stories, the nuances. She learned that their world was not savage. It was complex, rich, and governed by rules as strict and binding as any in her own world. Tala, humbled and confused, became her first true friend. The hatred in her eyes was replaced by a deep, abiding gratitude. She taught Eliza how to bead, how to tan a hide until it was as soft as velvet, how to bake bread in the hot ashes. Through Tala, Eliza learned the language of the women. And then there was Kyle. He had watched her, assessed her, and finally he spoke to her. He found her one evening by the stream, where she was gathering water, not as a slave, but as a woman of the rancheria. "Your English is good," she said, breaking the silence. He sat on a rock nearby, not looking at her. "I was at the Carlisle School, in Pennsylvania." Eliza froze. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School. It was a place designed to kill the Indian and save the man. "My father," Cale said, his voice hard, "thought we should know our enemy. He sent me to learn the white man's tongue, his ways, his lies. I learned, and then I came home." "Silas Blackwood," Eliza said, her voice low. "You knew what he was." "I knew he was a coward," Cale said. "He dealt in guns and whiskey. He was poisoning my people and his own. He was a man without honor." "And he sold me to you." "Yes." "Why did you buy me?" Cale finally turned to look at her. The moonlight softened the hawk-like sharpness of his features, but his eyes were still intense. "I do not know. I saw him throw you in the dust, and I saw that you did not break. I thought, maybe you were strong." "I wasn't," Eliza said, thinking of the journey, the despair. "You are," he countered. "You learned our language. You work. You saved Chispa. You are not the woman who came here." "No," Eliza agreed, looking at her calloused hands. "I am not." He stood up. "Stone Gazer says you have strong medicine. He is right. My people, we are in a hard time. The white eyes press in. We need strong medicine." He left her then, but the conversation lingered. He had not offered comfort. He had offered a purpose. Eliza Gray, the society girl from St. Louis, the bartered bride of Fort Gamble, was gone. In her place was Tiata, the name Stone Gazer had given her, White Dove, a name she was slowly, painfully earning. She was respected. She was finding her place. But the world outside the canyon did not sleep. The fall came, painting the cottonwoods a brilliant, aching yellow. The rancheria was preparing for winter, the women drying meat, the men hunting. Eliza, now Tiata, moved among them with a confidence that felt new and strange. She was a healer. She had delivered a baby, set a broken arm, and her poultices, a blend of Stone Gazer's herbs and her own knowledge of hygiene, were working. The respect she had earned was real. The children no longer stared. They ran to her, calling her name. Tala taught her beadwork, and Eliza's fingers, once accustomed to piano keys, now wove intricate patterns. The love, however, was still a quiet, unformed thing. It was in the way little Hawk would sit silently by her wickiup, just to be near her. It was in the way Stone Gazer called her daughter. And it was in the long, silent moments she and Cale shared, watching the sunset, a new tension growing between them, not of captive and captor, but of man and woman. This fragile peace was shattered by a foolish mistake. Goya, the warrior who had first tormented her, had never forgiven Cale for his humiliation, or Eliza for her rise in status. He and two other young warriors, hungry for glory and white man's goods, defied Cale's orders and raided a small, isolated trading post near the Gila River. They returned with 2 kegs of whiskey, a few rifles, and a stack of brightly colored blankets. Kyle was furious. He confronted Goya in the center of the camp. "You have broken the peace. You bring the Indaa, white soldiers, down on us." "We bring gifts," Goya retorted, drunk on whiskey and pride. "Look." He threw one of the blankets at Cale's feet. "We are rich." Eliza, drawn by the shouting, saw the blanket. It was a thick, wool trade blanket, a vibrant red, and it was marked with small, dark stains. Her blood ran cold. She pushed through the crowd and knelt, her fingers brushing the fabric. She didn't need to see the faded U.S. Army Medical Corps stamp on the corner to know what it was. She had seen one like it in a medical journal in St. Louis. Where did you get this? She asked Goya, her voice trembling. The trader. He was sick. We took his things, Goya boasted. Eliza stood up, her face pale. Stone gazer, she said, her voice tight. We must burn them. All of them. Now. It is a good blanket, Goya sneered. The white woman wants it for herself. It is sick, Eliza snapped, her voice ringing with an authority that silenced him. She turned to Cale. The trader wasn't just sick. Those stains, the fever, it's smallpox. The word fell like a death sentence. The Apaches had no name for it, only the red sickness. It was a terror that eclipsed the U.S. cavalry. But it was too late. Goya's wife had already taken a blanket. His children were wrapped in another. Stone Gazer's face went ashen. It has begun. The first case appeared 3 days later. Goya's youngest son. The fever, the rash, the weeping pustules. Within a week, the rancheria was a camp of the dying. The screams and the keening of the mourning women filled the air. People fled to the hills, but they carried the sickness with them. Kyle and Stone Gazer tried to maintain order, but the tribe was gripped by a panic more potent than any enemy. Eliza, however, did not panic. She was terrified, but she was also a healer. Cale, she commanded, finding him trying to reason with a group of fleeing families. You must listen to me. This is not a curse. It is a disease. It spreads from person to person. We have to separate. Separate? The healthy and the sick. We must have a pest house, a quarantine. Kyle, his own face etched with fear and grief, saw the steel in her eyes. He trusted her. What do we do? For the next 4 weeks, Eliza and Cale fought a war. With Stone Gazer's blessing and Cale's authority, they moved the entire rancheria. The sick were moved to the Spirit Cave, a large dry cavern system in the canyon wall, where they could be isolated. The healthy, fewer every day, moved their wiki-ups upwind. Eliza became a general. She was tireless, ruthless in her hygiene. Boil all the water. Burn the bedding of the dead. Do not touch the sick unless you have to, and wash with yeba, soap root, after. She and Stone Gazer became the camp's only doctors. They were the only ones allowed in the pest cave. They moved among the dying, a strange blend of two worlds. Stone Gazer chanted, prayed, and administered his herbal remedies for the fever. Eliza, with her white man's medicine, focused on hydration, cooling baths, and preventing the spread. She showed them how to make a thin gruel of mescal and corn to keep their strength up. She forced water between blistered lips. It was a living nightmare. The stench of death and sickness was overpowering. She lost Goya. She lost his entire family. She lost Iala, Little Hawk's mother. Tala, mad with grief, tried to run into the cave to be with her dying sister-in-law. Eliza had to physically stop her, wrestling her to the ground. You can't, Eliza wept, holding her friend. Think of Chispa. He has lost his mother. He cannot lose you too. Tala collapsed in Eliza's arms, her fight gone, replaced by a terrible hollow grief. From that day on, Tala took charge of the healthy children, guarding them like a wolf. Kyle was Eliza's shadow. He did the grim work, carrying the dead from the cave to be burned, enforcing the quarantine, hauling water. He watched her, his admiration and awe growing daily. She was covered in filth, her hair hacked short to keep it clean, her eyes sunk in dark circles, but to him, she had never been more beautiful. She moved through the cave, a figure of calm, her voice gentle, whether she was speaking English, Spanish, or Apache. She held the hand of a dying warrior. She cleaned the sores of a whimpering child. One night, sitting at the mouth of the cave, exhausted, Eliza finally broke. She put her head in her hands and began to sob, silent, racking sobs for the people she'd lost, for the horror of it all. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Cale. He sat beside her, not speaking. He just sat, a solid, warm presence in the cold, dark night. After a long time, her sobs subsided. "You blame yourself," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I could have been faster," she whispered. "I should have known." "You saved us," he said, his voice rough. "Tiata, look at me." She looked up. His face was close, his black eyes searching hers. "Before you, the red sickness would have taken us all. We would have scattered and died. You held the center. You are the heart of this people now." He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of pure, profound respect, of shared burden. "You are not Bistic. You are not Inde. You are Shike, my friend, my kin." And in that moment, surrounded by death, Eliza felt the first, true stirring of love. It was not the fragile, pretty love of St. Louis. It was a love forged in fire, grit, and survival. It was as strong and unforgiving as the land itself. When the sickness finally passed, the rancheria was decimated. They had lost nearly a third of their people. But they were alive. They were a community, scarred and broken, but held together by the new, unbreakable bonds of shared tragedy. Eliza, the white dove, the healer, was no longer just respected. She was beloved. Winter was hard. The losses from the red sickness had left them weak. The hunters were few, the grief was heavy, but they endured. Eliza, Cale, Stonegazer, and Tala formed the new heart of the tribe. They were the pillars that held the survivors up. Tala had adopted her nephew, Little Hawk, and she and Eliza raised him together, a new, strange family. The love between Eliza and Cale was no longer unspoken. It was in every shared glance, every time he brought her the first piñon nuts, every time she saved him the best piece of smoked venison. It was a quiet, adult love, built on respect. There was no room for doubt. But as the snows began to melt in the high country, a new, old shadow began to fall. Silas Blackwood had not found his fortune in Mexico. His cowardice and greed had followed him, and he had returned to the Arizona Territory. He had fallen in with a group of scalp hunters led by a brutal ex-Confederate named Dutch Visser. They were a pack of jackals paid by the territory and by wealthy ranchers for every Indian scalp they brought in. Silas, with his smooth tongue, had become their planner, and he had a special target in mind. He'd heard whispers of a band of Chiricahua in the Dragoons who had been weakened by sickness, whispers of a white squaw who lived among them, a healer with strange medicine. Silas, in his dark, twisted heart, knew it was Eliza. The thought of her, his Eliza, not only surviving, but thriving among the savages, was an offense he could not bear. She was his property. She had betrayed him by not dying. He would reclaim what was his, and he would wipe out the filth that had touched her. He and Dutch Visser and a dozen other men, including a tracker named Cully Jones, rode north. The attack came at dawn, just as Eliza was returning from the stream. The first shot was a sound she hadn't heard in months, the sharp crack of a Spencer rifle, the same kind he had traded. A warrior, standing watch, crumpled from the rocks above. Then the whoops began, not the cries of Apache, but the drunken, blood-crazed yells of white raiders. "Scalps for silver!" Dutch Visser roared. chaos. Kyle, already awake, grabbed his rifle and began shouting orders. Tiata, get the children! To the spirit cave! Go! He didn't have to tell her twice. She ran to her wickiup, grabbing the small bag of medical supplies she always kept ready. Tala! She screamed. Chispa! The cave! Tala, her face a mask of old familiar hatred, grabbed a rifle. Go! I will fight. No, we need you. He needs you, Eliza pleaded, pointing to a terrified little hawk. Tala's face wared, but she nodded, grabbed the boy, and began herding the other women and children toward the hidden entrance to the cave system. Eliza ran to Stone Gazer's lodge. He was already outside, painting Kale's face with sacred symbols. The white dove must fly, the old man said, his voice calm. Go, protect the new generation. We will hold the old world back. Eliza kissed his weathered cheek. Be safe, Nolly, grandfather. She ran. As she sprinted for the cave, a bullet kicked up dirt at her feet. Well, well, look what the buzzards dragged in. She froze. That voice, the smooth, whiskey-soaked voice of her nightmares. Silas Blackwood stood 20 yards away, blocking her path. He was no longer the handsome merchant. He was thin, his fine suit replaced by filthy buckskins. His beard was matted, and his eyes, those faded denim eyes, were wild with a feverish light. He held a revolver. Eliza, my love, he sneered. Playing Indian? It doesn't suit you. You're filthy. Silas, she said, her voice cold and steady. She stood tall. She was not the trembling girl he had sold. Did you miss me? He mocked. I came back for you, to save you from these animals. He gestured to the fighting. Dutch Visser and his men were already setting fire to the wickiups. These animals, Eliza said, her voice ringing, took me in when you sold me. They are my family. You are nothing. His face twisted. You're mine. I bought you, I paid for you, and I sold you. You are my possession. He lunged for her, grabbing her arm. We're leaving. I'll clean you up. We'll go to California. No. Eliza didn't struggle. She spoke the word like a stone. Don't you defy me, girl, he snarled, raising his hand. He never got the chance to strike her. A blur of motion. Kyle, his face painted, his eyes on fire, slammed into Silas, taking him to the ground. The two men rolled, a tangle of limbs and fury. Kyle, a master of hand-to-hand combat, was stronger, but Silas was a brawler. Silas's revolver skidded across the dust, landing near Eliza's feet. Cale gained the upper hand. He pinned Silas, his knife at the man's throat. You, Cale snarled, do not deserve to live. Cale, no, Eliza screamed. Her voice distracted him. A fatal half-second. Silas, his hand snaking out, had a second gun, a small derringer, hidden in his boot. He fired. The sound was small, a pop. Kyle grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and clutched his side, blood welling between his fingers. Silas laughed, a high, panicked sound, and scrambled to his feet, kicking Cale in his wounded side. So much for the brave warrior, he panted. He raised the derringer for a kill shot. Eliza, who had never fired a gun at a man in her life, who had dedicated her new life to healing, snatched Silas's fallen revolver from the dust. Silas, she screamed. He turned, his eyes wide. She fired. Once. The heavy .44 caliber bullet hit him in the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him against the canyon wall. He dropped the derringer, his face a mask of pure shock. He looked at the blood on his shoulder, then at her. Eliza, he whispered, as if he couldn't comprehend it. The fight had stopped. The raiders, seeing their leader was Cale, and their other leader, Silas, was down, began to lose their nerve. Stone Gazer, and the other warriors, emboldened, pressed the attack. "Fall back!" Dutch Visser roared. "Fall back!" The raiders grabbed Silas, dragging him, screaming, onto a horse and fled the canyon, the Apaches firing at them as they ran. Eliza didn't watch them go. She was on her knees, ripping at her own shift, pressing the wadded cloth against the sucking wound in Cale's side. "It's bad," he gasped, his skin pale. "Hush," she commanded, her healer's calm settling over her. "Stone Gazer, I need you. Now." She looked into Cale's eyes, her own fierce and full of tears. "You are not allowed to die," she whispered. "That is an order." He managed a weak smile. "Yes, Tiata." The bullet had passed clean through, but it had nicked a rib and his lung. For 2 days, Cale lay on the brink of death, his breath shallow, his body consumed by fever. Eliza and Stone Gazer did not leave his side. They worked together, a perfect fusion of two worlds. Stone Gazer chanted, drawing the bad medicine from the wound, keeping Cale's spirit tethered to his body. Eliza, her face grim, sterilized her father's old pocket knife, the one thing she'd kept from her past, and cleaned the wound, stitching it closed with a fine sinew thread. She used her yerba mansa poultices to keep the inflammation down and forced a willow bark tea, a natural aspirin, between his cracked lips. On the third morning, the fever broke. Cale opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Eliza, asleep, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand still clasping his. He was alive. She had saved him. While Eliza had been fighting for Cale's life, the world outside had shifted. Dutch Visser and his gang had been intercepted, not by Apaches, but by Marshal Joseph Phelps. The Marshal, a lawman as tough as the territory, had been hunting Visser's gang for months. He found them treating the wounded Silas Blackwood at a seedy ranch near Fort Gamble. Phelps, a man with an ear for the truth, listened to Blackwood's blubbering story about being captured and forced to lead the raid. Then he listened to Dutch Visser's angry, betrayed version, where he'd been promised easy scalps and a white squaw by Blackwood. It was Blackwood's own journal, found in his saddlebag, detailing the gun running, the original sale of Eliza, and the planned raid that sealed his fate. A week later, Marshal Phelps, 2 deputies, and a supply wagon rode into the Apache rancheria. Cale, now strong enough to stand, met them, flanked by Stone Gazer and a rifle-carrying Tala. Eliza stepped out of the wickiup, her blonde hair now growing back, a stark contrast to her dark buckskins. Marshal Phelps, a man who had seen everything, took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. "My name is Joseph Phelps. I'm a U.S. Marshal." He turned to Cale. "I'm not here for war. I'm here for justice." He explained what had happened. "Silas Blackwood is in my custody. He'll be tried in Prescott for gun running, for inciting a raid, and," he looked at Eliza, "for the sale and kidnapping of a white citizen. Miss Gray, your testimony will hang him." He gestured to the wagon. "We've brought supplies. Flour, coffee, blankets, a small reparation from the territory for the actions of Blackwood." Then he looked at Eliza, his eyes kind. "And ma'am, I'm here to take you home." The camp was silent. Home. The word felt strange, like a foreign language. Eliza looked around. She saw the burned wickiups. She saw the faces of the children, now orphaned, whom she had saved. She saw Tala, her friend, her sister. She saw Stone Gazer, her Nali. And she saw Cale. He stood tall, his side bandaged, his face proud. He did not speak. He would not choose for her. "Miss Gray," Phelps prompted gently, "you're safe now. You can come back to us." Eliza looked at the marshal. "Thank you, sir. I will give my testimony. I will write it all down. You can give it to the judge. Silas Blackwood is a monster, and he must be punished." "Of course," Phelps said. "My deputies will escort you. It's time to go." "No," Eliza said, her voice quiet, but clear as a bell. Phelps blinked. "Ma'am?" "I am Tiata," she said, standing taller. "I am the healer of the Inde. My family is here." She looked at Tala and Little Hawk. "My teacher is here." She smiled at Stone Gazer. Then she walked to Kale and took his hand, lacing her scarred fingers with his. "My heart is here." She turned back to the marshal. "My name is Eliza Gray, and I am home." Marshal Phelps stared at her for a long, long moment. He saw the strength in her, the peace in her eyes. He saw the way the Apache leader looked at her, and the way the fierce-eyed woman with the rifle nodded in approval. He had come to rescue a slave. He had found a queen. "I see," he said slowly. He put his hat back on. "Well, Tiata, I will see that your testimony is delivered." He gave her a small, respectful bow. "God be with you." He and his men left the supplies and rode out of the canyon, leaving the rancheria in peace. That evening, as the sun set, painting the canyon walls in hues of fire and rose, Kale and Eliza stood on the cliffs overlooking their home. The air was clean, the sounds of the village, children laughing, women talking, rose to meet them. "You could have gone," Kale said. "Back to your world, soft beds, fine dresses." Eliza smiled. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "That world," she said, "was a prison. It was a place where women were traded like property, where a man's honor was as thin as dust." She touched the healed-over scar on her hand. This was my slavery. It was hard. It was brutal. But it was real. The storm. It washed away the girl I was. It left the woman I am." Kyle turned and took her face in his hands. His touch was no longer assessing. It was gentle. It was love. "My Tiata," he whispered. "My white dove. My healer. My heart." He kissed her, not with the fire of a raid, but with the slow, deep certainty of the mountains, of the earth, of a home truly found. She was no longer a slave. She was respected. She was loved. And she was finally free. And so, the woman known as Eliza Gray vanished into the Arizona territory. But the legend of Tiata, the white dove, was just beginning. She proved that a person's life isn't defined by what's done to them, but by the choices they make when the storm is raging. She was traded. She was broken. But in the heart of the canyon, she rebuilt herself, not with the soft materials of her old life, but with the iron and grit of the Wild West. What did you think of Eliza's incredible journey? Her story is one of ultimate survival and transformation. If you were moved by her resilience, please let us know in the comments. And if you love tales of the untamed West, full of drama, heartbreak, and strength, then please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a great story. And, most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories to tell.